that book has been very strange. Every time another disease comes along, sales spike again. They spike like a fever. But I was listening to religious radio from out of Arvada, and this preacher was saying, once in every generation, the plague will fall among them. And I had cold. And of course, what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, what if everybody dies? But because I'm an optimist, I said, well, almost everybody. There'll be a few people left, like guys like me. But, so that came from that. And Cujo.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a biker. I started off, as so many ignorant people do, with one kind of bike before finally moving up to Harley Davidson, which is real. It's American, what can I say? But I did have a bike that was not a Harley Davidson, and it started to miss and skip, and I couldn't seem to fix it. And this postman in town said, well, there's a guy up around Seven Maples Farm who will be able to fix that for you if you can get it up there. And I said, well, why don't I give it a shot? And I took the bike, and it was fine for a little while. And this farm, which had a garage attached to it, was way out in the middle of nowhere. And just as I got up into the driveway, the bike quit. And it rolled to a stop, and I thought, well, I got here. At least that's, and then this St. Bernard came out of the garage. It was the biggest thing you'd ever seen in your life. I was out in the open on a motorcycle, and the guy who ran the farm came out and said, well, don't worry about Lucky. He's great with people. And Lucky starts, you know. And his hindquarters bunched down, and he was going to go for me, and the guy had a socket wrench, and he just whipped it down on the dog's hindquarters, and the dog shrank down, and that was it. And he looked at me, and there was not a word of apology. He said, Lucky just must not like you. But the incident kind of stayed in my mind, and finally I wrote a book about it. And I want to mention one more, and I'm going to read something new for you. But I can remember one time, around the time that the stand was winding up. I was in Colorado, and again it was a case of car trouble. This time it was a transmission in an American Motors Matador. Basically, it fell out on the street, and the tow truck came, and I had to walk home. And I cut through a park, and there was a little wooden bridge in the park, and I walked over the bridge, and I had on a pair of boots, sort of like these, except classy. And the heels made this sort of hollow clunking sound on the boards. And I thought of a story called The Three Billy Goats Gruff that I knew from childhood. Who's that trip-trapping on my bridge? And I got to thinking about how that's basically the nut of everything that scares us. Who is that trip-trapping on my bridge? Who's just taking notice of us? What awful thing might be closing in? And I started to think on that walk home about all the things that had scared me, all the monsters, all the things in the movies. And I started to think that I would like to write, since I'd started to get this reputation as the horror meister. I hate that. You can't even be a mister. You're demoted to meister. The horror meister is better than the schlockmeister. I've been called both. But anyway, so I started to think about all these monsters, and I thought I would like to, if I'm going to get this reputation, wouldn't it be great to write a story that had all the monsters in it? Just sort of a final exam on all the things that scare people. You put in Frankenstein and the Mummy and the werewolf, Rodan, all the Japanese monsters, everything. Put it all in. Get it all in there. Vampires, everything. And I will call this book It. Because that's the basis of horror to me, is just that it. We don't know what it is. And my wife said, "That's crazy, Steve. Don't do that. The critics will call it shit." They will say it and shit. And I said, well, yes, probably they will, but I'm going to call it anyway. And I was thinking, well, what's the scariest thing of all? It ought to be something that children see that scares them more than anything else in the world. I said, I'm going to make it a fucking clown. And it worked out well. I even scared myself. So I can tell you where some of these things came from, and when I'm in front of an audience, I can, some of these things, if they say, where do you get your ideas, I can say some, but there are certain things that this is what the mystery is of what I do, what you do if you write. And one of the really wonderful things, the unquantifiable things, is if you ask me about some of these other books, I don't know, I don't remember where they came from. The Dead Zone, I don't know where that came from. Just at some point, I felt like, oh shit, I don't know. I just wrote it, the Green Mile. I have this pervasive image of a guy in a prison who was pushing a cart full of candy and sandwiches and this sort of thing. And the people that he was servicing in the cells were condemned prisoners. And they were on this green corridor. And that's really all that I had when I started it. And that eventually didn't even show up in the book, although the guy pushing the cart eventually morphed into John Coffey, who was the guy. I've got a book coming out in about a month. It's called 11/22/63, and it's about a man who discovers he calls it a rabbit hole in time, and he's able to go through this, and you always come out at the same place 2 minutes before noon on September 9th, 1958. And this friend of his gets him to commit to the idea of going through this and living in the past and stopping Lee Harvey Oswald from killing President Kennedy, because he claims that that's the moment that changed everything. And I originally tried to write that book in 1971 or 1972 when I was teaching school. And the research requirements were too much for me at that time. And I'm really glad I didn't try to write it then, because 71 was still, that wound was still very fresh. For people of my generation, I was barely 17 when Kennedy was assassinated. That was our 9/11. And I can remember around 1970 or 71, I was teaching school, and there was this ongoing conversation, as there has been ever since, about whether Oswald acted alone, whether he acted at all, whether it was conspiracy, this, that, and the other thing. And there's a book called Oswald's Tale by Norman Mailer, where he speaks very eloquently about that. And he talks about how when he went into writing the book, he was convinced that Oswald was what he claimed to be, which was a patsy, and that there was some sort of conspiracy that had been papered over. And when he came out of working on the book, which involved traveling to Russia and doing thousands of interviews, he became convinced that it was the truth, that Oswald did act alone. And he says at one point in the book, and I quoted this at the start, that if you believe in a world where one lonely, unbalanced man can bring down the leader of the most powerful nation on earth in the midst of his security and his retinue, then you believe in a universe that's absurd. And that's one of the reasons why so many people refuse to believe that. They'll believe that there was a gunman on the grassy knoll. They'll believe that there was a gunman in a sewer that was watching with a periscope, that somebody was in Dallas County Jail shooting from the 3rd floor, from boxcars, E. Howard Hunt, blah, blah, blah. There was even people who believed for a while that there was no Oswald, that Oswald was a clone, that he was a Russian agent who had been fixed up in some X-Files way to look like Lee Harvey Oswald. And they convinced his widow, Marina Oswald, who's still alive, that this was the case, so they dug him up and they did the DNA, and of course it was Oswald. So anyway, I think that we were talking about that in the teacher's room, about the number of coincidences that would have to be involved for Oswald to be there. It almost seems malignant because at that point so many things were at a tipping point. It could have gone either way. So I thought it would be fun to write the book and see what happened. But I can't remember exactly where I got the idea. What I want to read isn't from that book, because thank God I'm not on a book tour. I'm going to be on a book tour in about a month, and I'll eat beige food. I'll get the media and everything, but I feel like you guys are my friends, and I don't have to sell you anything. Thank you. God knows you bought plenty and put our kids through school. And that's a wonderful thing. But for me, you know, I live in relative isolation most of the time, and to get out and to get this kind of response is always humbling, because there's part of me that also wants to please people. I guess if I were a girl, I would always be pleased. Anyway, I can tell you that this is an idea that I've had for some time, and I wrote a novel in the 70s called The Shining. God, it's like being Leonard Skinner, you know? Freddie Freebird. The Grateful Dead. But anyway, I always wondered what happened to that kid, Danny Torrance, when he grew up. And every now and then, you know, people will say to me sometimes, they'll ask, one of the other questions they'll ask, do you keep a notebook? Do you keep an idea notebook? And I don't, because I think it's the best way in the world to immortalize bullshit and really bad ideas. If you don't keep a notebook, a kind of Darwinian process takes place, and the bad ideas just, they go away. But the good ones, the important ones, the ones that are important to me, they stick around, they bounce back up every now and then. I kept wondering, what's Danny Torrance doing? What's going on with him now? Where did he go from after this terrible experience? And little by little, this story started to form. And it's almost done. The book isn't finished yet. It's called Dr. Sleep. And I think with the blessing, it will get done. And this kind of goes back to what's the worst thing that you could think of? And it's funny how an idea like that worms into your mind, and you start to look at perfectly ordinary things, and they start to look sinister to you. And I thought, well, I knew that there were bad people in this story.